On Friday, European Union member states finally approved the EU's largest ever free trade deal, with the South American bloc Mercosur. Having been in the works for more than 25 years, the trade deal has regularly been stalled, delayed and put on ice, with particular opposition coming from France and agricultural lobbies. However, some last-minute concessions by the European Commission managed to win over Italy, which was the crucial vote, ahead of Friday's meeting. So in this video, we're going to explain the EU-Mercosur Free Trade Agreement, what's in it, why it's been so contentious, why it's finally been approved, and whether its opponents have any remaining hopes of stopping it. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. Now, if you have a sense of déjà vu right now, it's because we've done a number of EU-Mercosur videos in the past, at various stages of this tortuously slow trade deal. Since it's been a while since the last one, as a reminder, Mercosur, or the Southern Common Market, is a South American trade bloc founded in 1991 comprising Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay and Uruguay, and Bolivia, which as its newest member would initially be excluded from the EU trade deal. Negotiations for an EU-Mercosur trade deal began back in 1999, but it wasn't until 2 decades later in 2019 that talks finally concluded, and an agreement in principle was struck. However, the whole deal stalled from that point on, largely due to opposition on the EU side, particularly from the likes of France, over environmental concerns related to Brazil's then-President Jair Bolsonaro and the potential damage of the trade deal to European farmers, who've long protested against such a deal. Having been on ice for a few years, momentum for the deal built again in 2023, as, among other things, there was a new environmentally conscious government in Brazil, and eventually, in early December 2024, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen finally signed the agreement with Mercosur's leaders in Uruguay. But as you may have guessed, this was not the end of the saga, as the free trade deal, officially the EU-Mercosur Association Agreement, still needed approval by the EU Council, made up of the governments of each member state. Given it's now the start of 2026, and we're still talking about Council approval, it evidently took a lot of time for this next stage to be completed. So what is it about the trade agreement that is so contentious, and what are the pros and cons? For the EU, it opens up Mercosur's pretty protectionist market for European exports, things ranging from manufactured goods like automobiles to specialty agricultural products like wines and cheeses. It diversifies the European trade portfolio at a time when global trade, particularly EU-US trade, has been upended, and also gives the EU better access to Mercosur exports like critical minerals that are essential for the energy transition. Countries like Germany and Spain are big supporters of the trade deal, seeing it as providing a welcome boost to their industries and economies. As for Mercosur, the agreement unlocks access to the European market for Mercosur exports, which is especially useful for things like raw materials and agricultural goods. This naturally boosts Mercosur's trade diversity, and also should attract greater investment in South America by European firms. It will also see the EU contribute €1.8 billion through its Global Gateway initiative to support Mercosur's green and digital transition. Overall, the EU-Mercosur trade deal would be the EU's largest ever free trade accord, bringing together a market of well over 700 million people, eliminating tariffs on over 90% of bilateral trade, and, according to the Commission, saving European exporters some €4 billion annually. However, the biggest cause of opposition to the deal in Europe is the concern that European farmers will be undercut by large-scale and competitive South American producers of things like beef, poultry and soy, and the concern that the deal could contribute to greater environmental destruction in South America. At basically every stage of progress, the deal has sparked farmers' protests in Brussels and elsewhere. France, as a large and proud agricultural exporter with a powerful farmers' lobby, is the primary opponent of the Mercosur deal, and is joined in opposition by the likes of Poland, Austria, Hungary and Ireland. Now, it's worth pointing out, though, that the deal does not mean that, say, Brazilian beef will flow uncontrolled into Europe. The agreement would see the EU allow imports of 99,000 tonnes of Mercosur beef at a new lower duty of 7.5%, phased in over 5 years, a figure which represents 1.6% of total European beef production and is less than half of the current imports from Mercosur. On the flip side, skeptics in Mercosur are concerned that their local industries will face greater competition from imports of European manufactured goods, as well as European companies' improved access to Mercosur's public procurement markets. To sweeten the deal, back in 2024, additional environmental commitments were added, a rebalancing mechanism for dispute mediation and corrective measures was introduced, and the EU set aside a €1 billion reserve in the quote, unlikely event that the European agricultural sector suffers negative repercussions. But to be approved by the Council, the trade deal needed support from a qualified majority of member states, meaning a so-called blocking minority of just 4 countries representing 35% of the EU population could derail it. Essentially, Italy, as one of the EU's larger member states and relatively sceptical of the deal, became the decisive vote, as if it swung behind France and co, they would have a blocking minority. However, more than a year later, the EU Council finally approved the trade deal, as Italy had been won over by the Yes camp following new concessions from Brussels. These included offering earlier access to up to €45 billion in agricultural funding, cutting import duties on fertilisers, and putting in place safeguards that could suspend imports of sensitive farm produce. And so, on Friday, the EU-Mercosur Association Agreement was finally approved by the Council, after more than a quarter of a century of work. For the European Commission and supportive member states, particularly Germany and Spain, and indeed Mercosur, this is a big and long-awaited win, and a bright spot for free trade advocates in a particularly turbulent time. However, France and its President Emmanuel Macron will not be celebrating. It represents a diplomatic setback for Macron, who has managed to stall the deal for years. Already weak at home, where he's grappling with domestic political instability and unpopularity, this perhaps reflects the weakening of Macron's influence on the diplomatic stage in Brussels. Far-left and far-right French opposition parties have already said they'll seek to topple France's weak minority government, owing to Macron's failure to stop the deal. But France has vowed to keep on fighting, because, as you may have guessed, the deal isn't quite over the finish line, as it still needs to be ratified by the European Parliament in the next few months. With pressure from agricultural lobbies and environmental groups opposed to the deal, the vote could end up being tight. If you're interested in this, in the latest issue of our magazine, we talked to fellow creator Money and Macro to discuss how Europe can revive its economy, getting into how the continent can balance conflicting priorities, handle Trump, and deal with China's competitive threat. There's so much more in this issue too. In addition to our cover story about the new Middle East, there's also full sections dedicated to UK, EU and global news. The global section discusses why Trump's mandate isn't quite what it seems, how politicians conquered social media, as well as our rundown of the biggest elections that happened in 2025. Our UK section runs through the rise of the New Left, why this year's elections are critical at all levels, as well as the strategies Starmer ought to take to maintain power, and Farage to gain power. As well as the interview, the EU section also includes Macron's fall from grace and how Albania has implemented an AI minister. Subscribers to Too Long automatically get 20% off every copy as long as they stay subscribed. But as a special New Year offer, you can get an additional 30% off your first issue if you use the code at checkout.